Okay, so yeah, thanks for taking the time to come. I know it's one of the last few days where the weather is still good, so thanks for coming inside. It's my pleasure to have Florentin today with us. So Florentin did his PhD with Stéphane Mala in Paris, so pretty nice place and pretty nice advisor. And now he's been doing his postdoc at NYU, also joined with the Flatiron. So he's pretty lucky, he has this fellowship, so he's completely independent in his postdoc, but he's been working with Joan Bruna and some people at Johns Hopkins as well. And I think the very exciting thing for me, which is pretty rare nowadays, is that Florentin's research is really something where both practitioner and theorists can find practical takeaway. And this is pretty difficult to do. So I think, if anything, that's one thing I'm trying to learn from him and this group. So yeah, hopefully you're gonna get something away from this as well. And with that, so yeah, thanks for being here, and you can take it away.
Thank you very much for that super nice introduction. I've also been learning from you exactly, how to do things that are useful for practice. And feel free to interrupt, interject at any time with questions, remarks, etc. So today I'm going to tell you about neural encodings and their scaling laws. So that's work that I did with Brice Ménard at Johns Hopkins University. And I explain what I mean really by neural encodings and what the scaling laws are. So my main research goal is to understand deep learning, why it works so well, why is these networks generalizing? And I'm not alone, many people are asking these questions. And one thing that it's such a hard problem is what does it even mean to understand what is going on in these systems? When you have billions of parameters, how can you understand something that's so high dimensional? And although I'm not a physicist, working with a physicist like Brice, I've come to appreciate the answer that physics use when they tackle this sort of problem, which is to find key variables, like summary statistics, that summarize the behavior of the system and that hopefully have a predictable behavior. So one example is the entropy or temperature of a gas that can have millions and even many, many more orders of magnitudes of particles, and yet there's a few numbers that summarize what is going on. So how can we do this for deep learning? So there's one obvious summary statistic that has received a lot of attention. It's the loss, because it's easy to measure and it's also important for practice. So that's going to be one summary statistic. And does it have a predictable behavior? Well, a recent finding from 5 or 8 years ago, depending on which paper you look at, is that you have scaling laws. So there is a predictable behavior of the loss of these networks as you scale resources. So the resources can be the amount of compute or the number of training samples that you use to train these models on, or the number of parameters, things like this. You find these power laws that appear as lines here when you put the x and y axis in log scale. And so there's been a lot of activity in the theoretical community to try to understand where these scaling laws come from. Can we predict them from theory? So if I draw a little bit cartoon to what are people doing is we have this empirical characterization of performance, our neural scaling laws. And I've tried to find theoretical explanations, but for now, this has only been done really for kernel ridge regression. So that's KRR. So basically linear regression. We have a pretty good understanding of this in here, but not really deep learning. And if we look closer at these scaling laws and try to understand where they come from, there's a key quantity in there that are called the degrees of freedom. They are basically the effective number of parameters that you can estimate from the data. So I will give you more details about this later in the talk. But there's this key quantity that really is the source of these scaling laws. And it's what I would call a characterization of the encoding, which is the learned parameters. So first you characterize the learned parameters or the learned function, and then from this you can derive what the loss is, what is the performance. So now there's a natural question, which is what is the equivalent of this quantity, these degrees of freedom, for deep networks? And maybe before we can analyze it theoretically, can we measure such a quantity? What would be its behavior? Does it have predictable behavior, like degrees of freedom in linear regression. And so that's what this talk is going to be about. Can we find a notion of dimensionality, degrees of freedom in deep networks that characterize the size or like the effective number of parameters and what is its behavior? So when you try to parallel what has been done for linear regression, there's an immediate difficulty, which is that deep networks are much more complicated, of course. So here is, for instance, a fully connected network. F of x is the output on input x. And there's a bunch of weight matrices, W1 to WL, with the pointwise nonlinearity sigma, and then we have a linear layer at the end, theta. And the main problem is that now we're not just learning a vector like in linear regression, we're also learning weight matrices. So how do we define the dimensionality of or like the effective dimensionality of a matrix? There's a pretty natural thing to do, which is to measure the rank of these things. So let me give you a little bit of intuition of like what this rank tells us. So here I trained a convolutional network on an image classification task, and I'm looking at the singular values of the weight. Okay, so the y-axis, can you see? Yeah, the y-axis here is the singular value, and the x-axis is the index of that singular value. And there's two lines. The dashed line is what you have at initialization. So this is just basically Martian-Pastor distribution for those that know about random matrix theory. These are the singular values of a random matrix. And the solid line is what happens at the end of training. So what you see is that there are higher, like there's a few large singular values that have emerged, but the tail is pretty much the same. So just looking at this suggests that maybe what happens during training is that only a low-dimensional part of the weights really move, and that's what is really learned, while the rest is random initialization. And this you can check by connecting this to performance by doing explicitly a low-dimensional projection of the weights. Okay, so this plot is the accuracy of the network without any training when I just projected weights on the top k singular directions as a function of k. So when you keep no directions, of course, you have terrible performance. If you keep all the directions, you have the maximal performance. But what you see is that here at about 40 dimensions, you capture everything about the performance. So what I want to do here is measure this thing that here I just eyeballed 40 quantitatively and look what is its behavior in deep nets.
Sorry, are you
yes?
plotting the first weight, or just do you have
Oh, this is a single layer. You can do this at all layers, and it's the same story. Yes. Thank you for the question.
This is just one initialization?
There's actually two lines here, a blue and a red one, and there are two different initializations. So you have exactly the same behavior. This is robust to initialization. Okay, so how exactly do we measure this dimensionality? Let me give you a precise definition now. So we form the covariance matrix of the weights, W transpose W. And then we extract its spectrum. So that's the eigenvalues of the covariance, or the square singular values of the weights. And then we do this key shrinkage step, which is basically clip everything that is below this line here, which is the variance of the random initialization. So for those of you that are experts in random matrix theory, this is clipping everything that's about the BBP transition threshold. There's a formula that's not very important here. The key point is basically that we're thresholding at this value and keeping everything that's above. And then the resulting sequence of eigenvalue, we take a soft measure of the rank, which is the participation ratio. So the sum of the eigenvalues squared divided by the sum of the square eigenvalues. And if they were all ones and zeros, you would get exactly the number of non-zeros. And this is a soft measure that generalizes naturally when you have a decay, thanks to measure some measure of rank. All right, so where am I going to measure this? I'm going to train CNNs on ImageNet with a standard architecture, so convolution, ReLU, batch norm, with 6 layers. And I'm going to focus on this one architecture so that I can do an exhaustive search on what is the effect of the data, the hyperparameters, things like this, so that we can understand the effect of all these things. And right now, the next step is to extend this to other architectures, and we're working on it right now, and it seems that these things extend to other architecture. But for this talk, I will have only one architecture. And we do this exhaustive search on many networks, and they all manage to solve the task. I won't focus too much on performance here. I'm more interested in what these networks learn. And there's one small thing that I'll do to the architecture to simplify the analysis is to factorize convolutions into two parts. One part that's only spatial, also known as depth-wise convolution, and one part that's only across channels, known as point-wise. So what I mean by this is when you train a convolutional network, you have a weight tensor that have 4 dimensions. There's height and width of the spatial filter, and then there's input channels and output channels. And tensors are a bit complicated to analyze, especially to apply spectral tools to them. So we just factorize this tensor as a sequence of 2 matrices, one that just looks at space and one that just looks at channels. So it's a bit similar to transformers, where you have a tension that mixes information across the sequence dimension, and then another thing that MLP that mixes information across the embedding dimension. We just separate these 2 things, so that then we can just look at matrices. So
this is only for analysis, right? Not for training.
no, so this is also how we train the network. There has been a long list of work. I've worked a little bit on this, and so have many other people, to show that this is always something you can do. Both this doesn't hurt performance to do this change, and also even there's a way in which you can show that what this is doing is very similar to what that's doing. So you train the network here and network here, and you see that they are actually the same behavior. So I'm going to look at these matrices, which has matrices that apply along channels. So it's one neuron at a given position that looks at what happens along channels there. Okay, so let's measure this and see what is its behavior. So I train a network to do classification on images like this, right? There's 1,000 classes. And I measure the dimensionality, which is some measure of the number of learned features, right? The number of components that have emerged from the random initialization at all layers. So first question before I show you is, what do you expect here for the dimensionality? Is it going to be 10, 100, 1,000? Is it going to increase with depth, or is it going to decrease? Do we have a reduction in dimensionality or an increase in dimensionality? So it turns out that we have an increase here. So this is the dimensionality as a function of layer for the 6 layers of the network. And one way to make sense of this is this in the convolutional networks, as you go deeper in the architecture, you look at larger and larger patches of the image. The receptive fields of the neurons grow. So you're coding for larger and larger parts of the input, so it makes sense that you would need to learn more features, right? Large patches have more possible variations than small patches.
The last one is
Yes, so what is the deal with the last one? So the last one is the classifier, and by construction, this will always be equal to the number of classes. So here, this is actually a network that was trained on 10 classes. And you'll see as I add more classes, you'll see that this will change. But apart from this, there is this continuous increase in dimensionality. And now to gain some intuition about what this does, we can do transformations to the data and see how this influences what we learn. Okay, so one thing that I can do, for instance, is perturb the data by doing shuffling. And here I'm going to consider 3 different types of shuffling. This is what I call the fine shuffle, where within patches you shuffle the order between pixels. This is a coarse shuffle, where you shuffle patches without changing the fine structure. And this is a complete shuffle, where you destroy completely the structure. And for all in this case, you can train a network to classify images. The networks are still able to recognize what is going on in the image. And measure the effect of dimensionality at all layers. And you see a qualitative agreement with what you expect. So when you destroy the fine structure for the purple line here, this changes the dimensionality mostly in the first layers that are looking at small patches of the image. While when you do a core shuffle, you destroy more the large-scale organization of the image, which means that you need to learn, which means that you need to learn more features. This is actually a harder problem. You need a higher dimensionality to solve this, and if you destroy everything, then the dimensionality increases everywhere. Now what's interesting is we can even go beyond natural images to see, how does the structure of the input affect what we learn. So these are 3 different types of Gaussian random fields. So just Gaussian distributions with some covariance, some spectral decay. And these are the dimensions that we find that are completely different from ImageNet. So there's these dimensionalities, they tell us a lot about the structure of the data. If you change totally the data that you have a completely different curve. Yes?
So these are all after training, I presume?
Yes.
So is the control before training a flat line?
Oh, before training, yes, you have dimensionality 0 because of this thresholding step. So I measure what is above the variance of the initialization. So at initialization, there's nothing. There's dimensionality of 0.
So the effective dimensionality, is that rank or relative rank?
Yes, it's rank, or like effective rank of covariance minus the identity, basically. It's like the number of spikes that I'm counting that are emerging from the spectrum. Yeah, also an interesting observation is, that the spectrum has no effect here, right? And there's one point here that we don't really understand, but apart from this, it's like all the curves line up.
Do these noise data also have labels?
Yeah, so they have labels that are here completely independent from the image, because there is no notion of class here. But there's still a task that the network can learn, because the network is basically memorizing this random assignment between images and labels, and the network is happy to do so. It manages to interpolate the training set. And this imperfect transition for the last curve, which is natural images but with random labels. Right? So just to isolate the effect of this, when you randomize the mapping from images to labels, there is still something to learn, although there is no notion of generalization. And the effect of this is that the network now has to memorize, which we see by higher dimensionality, and it seems that this memorization is mainly located in last 2 layers.
So you're not adding noise to the images?
No, here this is just x to y that I'm changing, right? But the one power of this approach is we can disentangle these 2 things. We can change x or change y, and then every time you measure and you see what happens. Whereas if you compare the performance, it's not clear what to measure for what's the performance for random labels. There is no generalization anymore. Okay, here's one last cute thing that you can do with this is, as you might know, the classes in ImageNet have a semantic structure. So the name ImageNet actually comes from WordNet, which is a hierarchical structure over words or like multiple words. So one example of this is you have the whole subtree of dogs with different breeds of dog that are organized in this way. And so we can consider what's the effect, like can we measure an effect of this when like classes are nearer or further apart from each other. So let me pick one reference class, which is a specific breed of dog, and then consider classes that are further and further apart in this hierarchy. So these are other breeds of dog that even I couldn't tell apart from each other, and this is butcher shop or something that is completely unrelated. So there's always 2 classes. There was always the same number of images, but there's still a notion of difficulty here. And this is completely reflected in the effective dimensionality in the way that we expect. I was surprised by how well this works. Just by looking at the weights of the network, you can find a trace of how difficult the task is. On easy task for classes that are far apart, you don't need to learn as many features to separate them as on hard tasks for classes that are very close to each other. All right, so we have this whole world of dimensionalities to explore for many different tasks every time we learn something about the structure of the task. So now I want to focus on scaling properties. Is there something quantitative and an empirical regularity that we can predict as I make my networks bigger, or I train on more data, or things like this? And the first parameter I'm going to consider is the width, so the number of channels. As you put more neurons in your network, that's kind of an obvious parameter for dimensionality, because by definition, the rank of the weight matrices is bounded by the dimension, right? So as I make these weight matrices bigger, does the rank increase or not, or does it plateau? So I've trained networks at different number of neurons. So this gray line here is the number of neurons allocated to each layer, and so that's the maximum dimensionality that you could have if you learned full rank matrices. And I'm going to increase this, so at all layers I'm going to add more and more neurons and see how the dimensionality increases. So when you have a very small network, you start with 1 neuron per layer at the first layer. Then you learn basically full rank matrices. You're just constrained by the number of neurons that you have. And if you increase the number of neurons, then you see that dimensionality increases, except at this last layer, which is just the number of classes. Keep increasing. And then at some point, there's a different behavior that emerges, which is that all these lines start piling to each other, piling on top of each other. So even though I have larger and larger matrices, both the input and output dimension are growing, then the effective rank remains stable. Yeah, the network could learn more features in a sense, but is not learning more features. And so we have these two regimes, one when you're constrained by width, and you're learning basically full rank matrices, and one where you're independent from width. And now what learning does not depend on the number of neurons. I even tried to train an architecture with a different shape here. So you could think that this comes from the shape of the architecture. So you train something that is flat, same number of neurons at all layers, you find the same curve. So this is in a sense independent from the architecture for the choice of how many neurons you allocate to each layer. Now let's explore the effect of the data in these two different regimes. So I have the narrow regime where I have a constrained encoding that's limited by the size of the architecture, and the wide regime where it's independent from width. Now I'm going to scale the amount of data that I use to train these networks, which for me is going to be the number of classes. So ImageNet has 1,000 classes, and I can take subsets of those to consider just classification between 5 classes or 10 or 20. And every time I train a network and I measure dimensionality. So when you're constrained by architecture, it doesn't matter what the task is. You're just learning as many features as you possibly can. But when you're not constrained, you start to see this difference emerging. And as if you train on a harder task with more data, you have larger dimensionality. And you could wonder whether it's the number of images or the number of classes that matter here. It turns out that it's the latter, it's the number of images. So this is really just about the size of the training data here. These are 3 experiments where I trained the network on 100,000 images, but grouped in different classes, so grouped in 10, 100, or 1,000 classes. So it changes the dimensionality of the classifier, but at all other layers it's the same, which is also a very surprising observation. It doesn't matter what the task is, how many classes you have to discriminate for here, the dimensionality of the first, like all layers, but the last one. So if it only depended on the input and not really on the output. So now let's consider this joint space over width and data size, right? These are the 2 scaling axes that I'm going to consider. And we can measure dimensionality for all layers in every point of this plane. Okay, and that's what the color here. The color here is the effective dimensionality. So yellow is high dimensionality, and blue is low dimensionality. And I've traced these level sets here, which delimit 2 nice regimes. So there's one regime where the level sets are vertical. So here that means that you can scale data. It doesn't change dimensionality. Dimensionality only changes when you scale width. Whereas here, the level set lines transition to something horizontal where it's the opposite. Now it's data that you have to scale if you want to learn more features, and width has no effect. And you can best see it at layer 5, but it's actually present at all other layers. It's just that it shifts to the right, and the angle, the slope of that line changes. So you can wonder what's the relationship of this with performance. So this is train accuracy of these networks in the same plane. So yellow here is when you reach 100% accuracy, when you interpolate the training set. And you find this line here, it's the same as here, that interestingly is the interpolation threshold. Right, so we see a trace in the encoding. There's a whether you're limited by width or by data actually corresponds for the last layer before the classifier to the interpolation threshold. Right, in terms of the test accuracy, so now this is about generalization to other images. You find also a transition, which is that these level sets, these lines tend to become more horizontal. So that means that you gain more accuracy per width, let's say, if you scale to the right. You get more accuracy when you add neurons if you're increasing dimensionality. And once you reach the regime where you no longer increase dimensionality, you still gain a little bit, but you get slower gains. So basically what you want to be for optimal scaling is on that line. Okay. So now let's take slices of this plot. Okay, and we can get scaling laws out of this. So let me start with horizontal slices. This is dimensionality as a function of width for different layers. And we find this is just a different visualization of what I showed you before, is that there is a regime where dimensionality increases with width, and then a second regime where it plateaus, and then suddenly it depends on data size. So here we have, in this regime, we have a scaling law that is sort of a trivial scaling law, which is that dimensionality is proportional to width. What's more interesting is to take vertical slices of this. So at fixed network size, increase the amount of data. And we see now we see scaling laws that appear at all layers, but have non-trivial exponents. So let me unpack what is going on here. If I look at the green curve, that's what happens when you have a very narrow network, so it doesn't matter how much data you have. Dimensionality does not increase. When you have a wide network, dimensionality increases as you train on more data until at some point you plateau. But the rate at which this dimensionality increases, so the number of features you learn when you train on a bigger data set, has a different exponent at different layers. So different layers are actually learning at different rates. Okay, and if you double the size of the training set, you're going to learn more features in the last layer than the first layer. These exponents increase with depth, and at the end, dimensionality is proportional to width. So to summarize our scaling laws, there are two regimes, and you have one depending on which regime you have. You have a regime where you're constrained by capacity, and dimensionality just scale with the width, and L is the number of neurons. And one where you're constrained by data, and you have an interesting exponent here. There's actually a third one that I'm not telling you about, which is scaling with number of training steps. So if you do early stopping, you will have a third regime where you can be time constrained or compute constrained, and you also have a scaling law there with an exponent, which is kind of similar as the data constraint. But here I'm looking at the end of training. So we have this ordered sequence of exponents that emerge, gamma 1 to gamma L. The last one's close to 1. And by construction, they're independent of width and data size. So in physics, they're what we would call intensive. So they're characteristic of the learning process. They don't depend on how much resources you're allocating to it. And the last layer achieves what we think is the maximal rate, where the rank is just proportional to the amount of training data, which you could think maybe as some sort of memorization regime, right, where you just encode the whole data set in the weights. So now there's a question, is what determines these learning exponents. So I've plotted them here as a function of layer. This is the summary of what comes out of our analysis, so the picture of what's going on in the network. Where each layer you have an exponent that can be between 0 and 1, where 0 would correspond to compression. You're compressing the data set into something that does not depend on its size, where 1 is memorization. The size of the number of effective parameters is proportional to data. and we have this shape. Can we predict this shape? What does it mean? So that's now what we're doing. Let me give you one interesting example, which is what happens when you constrain the expressivity of the network. So if I prune the network after 2 layers, and now I just consider a network that has 2 layers and then a classifier, and then I train this to do image classification. So it does quite poorly because it's limited at looking at small patches of the image, so it's not able to solve the task. And what's interesting is that this has an effect on this exponent here. So it does not reach 1. You're not in a regime where you can memorize the whole data set. But this also shows you that the fact that this increases, that the second layer could actually learn more features if you had put a classifier here as opposed to the rest of the network. So there's some regularization effect that in this deeper network, you learn fewer features than you could. So why and what does this tell us about the behavior of the network? But we'd like to have a theory for this. So to look for a theory, let me go back to a kernel regression, or linear regression, where we by now have a pretty good understanding of what happens, and then I'll try to come back to networks. So what is going on when we want to learn a function through kernel regression? One way to picture this is to expand the function that we want to learn in a basis that's given by the kernel. So if you have a translation invariant kernel, that's the Fourier basis. So you have a sequence of coefficients, right? An infinite sequence of coefficients that correspond to frequencies of the function that you have to learn. And when you have n labels, and training data of size n, this puts a maximum resolution, kappa, on what you can see, which is going to scale like 1 over n. Right? And basically, it's the variance, something when you average over n samples, you have a variance of 1 over n. So this creates a distinction between 2 parts of these coefficients. There is a part that is learned that is going to be above this maximum resolution, and one part that's not learned, that you cannot see. You don't have enough data. And so this quantity d here is the degrees of freedom that I was mentioning, and that's what plays the role of effective dimensionality in linear regression. And you can characterize its behavior if you assume a shape for this decay here. So a typical assumption is that these coefficients decay like a power law. You have some exponent alpha. That's how fast these coefficients decay. That's a measure of the regularity of the function. Functions that are regular have very low energy at high frequencies, so this decay very fast. And functions that are irregular have a slower scaling. So you just, so you know that this is 1 over n. You know that this is k to the minus alpha. So you plug that in, and you find a scaling law for the dimensionality as a function of data, which is n to the 1 over alpha. And I'm going to rename 1 over alpha gamma to parallel the notation that I had. So this exponent here, gamma, that is related to the regularity of the function that you learn. And then if you want a scaling law for the loss, what is the error that you're going to make? You have some residual noise in the first coefficient of magnitude kappa, and so there is some error here. You can't estimate perfectly these coefficients. And then these ones you can't estimate, so there's an error that's commensurate to the amount of energy of the function. So if you do the calculation, you will find that this scales like to n to the minus 1 minus gamma. So let me plot this for you. So we have 2 scaling laws. As you have more data, you learn more features. So this is the first scaling law, effective dimensionality, and also the error decreases. But now we can consider what is the effect of the difficulty of the task on this. That's the prediction from this theory. So what happens if I have a more rough function that decays slower, so that corresponds to a slower alpha. So slower alpha, gamma is 1 over alpha, so larger gamma. So you see that the number of features that you learn, what is above the noise, is going to be larger, maybe counterintuitively, for harder tasks. So you learn more. It seems like you're learning faster. But at the same time, the errors decay slower because you have more energy in the tail, in all the things that you cannot estimate. So what this means is you have to pay attention when you talk about learning faster and slower. There are really 2 notions of learning rates. One that comes from the dimensionality, one that comes from the error. And they're inversely related. Okay, and one way to make sense of this is if you're a student solving practice problems before an exam, if for every problem you have to learn something new, then, so that means dimensionality increases fast, then it's probably not a good sign for what's going to happen for the exam, right? So the error decays slowly. Whereas if every time you see a new problem, you're like, oh, I know how to do this, I don't need to learn anything more, then you're going to do well on the exam, right? So you have this inverse relationship between the two. So this suggests that for us, we have these layers with this range of exponents where you have your dimensionality increases faster, deeper in the network. So if we had some notion of performance for each layer, then we can say that the last layers of the network are struggling in a sense, and like they're solving harder tasks. That's what this suggests. And it would be nice if we had a way to measure this. So let me connect these exponents to something else that we can actually measure in networks beyond performance, which is a different notion of generalization, which comes from comparing two different models. So imagine that I have two data sets that correspond to the same function, and I do linear regression on these two data sets. So it's independent samples, but from the same distribution. And then I can ask, did I learn the same parameters or not? And I'm going to measure basically their overlap. So to put a picture to this, whenever you do linear regression, you're only learning basically a projection of the true vector, right, on this subspace that you can estimate from the data. And that's what I'm representing with these ellipses here. So these ellipses here correspond to the signal-to-noise ratio in the different dimensions. So here, this red ellipse means that in this horizontal direction, I have a lot of signals, so I'm estimating the function well here. And in the orthogonal direction, I don't have signal. I'm not really estimating what the function is. And so there could be two different cases, right? You could have a lot of redundance between two encodings every time you train on a different realization of the data, or they could be completely complementary. And what I want to measure here is the size of this intersection, which is basically the overlap between them. It's the dimensionality of the intersection between these two ellipses. So here it would be large, and here it would be small. And this is going to be my notion of generalization. And what's very nice and maybe not obvious at first sight is that you can connect this to scaling properties. Because what would have happened if I trained my model on the two n samples, right, on the union of the two things instead of training two different ones? Then if they're redundant, nothing changed really. So I learned the same number of features. So here gamma is much smaller than 1. Whereas if they are complementary orthogonal, then I just learn twice as many features. And here gamma is close to 1. And it turns out that you can make this quantitative. So in linear regression, you can actually show that this dimensionality of the overlap scales like the dimensionality of each of the parameters, but multiplied by 1 minus gamma. I'm coming. So when gamma is close to 1, this goes to 0. Yes?
So are you describing a feature of the data or a feature of the classifier, or a properties of the classifier?
Oh, sorry. Here I'm still in linear regression. I'm going to tell you next slide what I mean by this in deep nets.
Okay, I see. So here we should think about this in terms of the data. Having this.
Yeah, so you should think of this in function space, really. You have a function and you're learning a projection of that function on some subspace, right? Or you have a parameter vector and then you're learning a projection of it on some subspace. And the subspace that you see depends on the data. If I have a different data set, I might see a different projection of the same vector. So now this equation, it gives us an avenue for checking whether this really happens in deep nets. What this means is, I can compare two networks. Now let's train two networks on different subsets of the data and try to measure, the features that they have in common. And this prediction tells us that there should be more things in common at earlier layers than at later layers. So how do we do this? How do we measure the overlap between weight matrices? So the natural, I think, generalization of this thing from vectors to matrices is that I'm going to look at the dominant eigenspaces of the weights, and I want to measure their intersection and measure the dimension of this intersection. Right? I was counting the number of eigenvectors with large eigenvalues. Let's just see how many they have in common. But there is a major difficulty to do this in deep nets, is that we have hidden layers, right? We don't have just one layer from input to the output. We have things in the middle. And these hidden layers, they're unconstrained. There's nothing that gives you a canonical ordering between dimensions. Because you could permute neurons. They're not constrained. What happens in the middle of the network is not directly constrained by the data. You only have constraints at the input and the output. And so a consequence of this is that in the middle, you actually have random rotations that come from the initialization. Every time you have a different network, you have a different rotation of the same space. So before we can do a meaningful comparison, we have to align these things. So a picture of this is that every time you train a network, every layer is actually randomly rotated. That's if you want a symmetry of the network in the training algorithm. And so the initialization breaks the symmetry, but if you have a different initialization, you have a different rotation. And what we're going to do is use a procedure to align everything to each other so that we can put things in the same space and then compare them meaningfully. And the technical tool here that we developed in previous work is called Procrustes alignment. So it's finding the optimal rotation or the optimal orthogonal transform that is going to align representations with each other. And this gives you a tool to translate from one space to another. Yes?
Will the behavior of the aligned network, are you trying to preserve the behavior of the network as you align it?
No, so this is not something that, this is actually not something that I'm doing to the network. This is just something that I'm measuring so that I can do comparisons after training.
So you're doing a linear alignment, but the transformations are in the end non-linear of the weights. So
No, so let's look at one layer, let's say the green layer of the network. I measure the representations in the first network and the second one. So I have two sets of representations, 2 point clouds in different spaces, and I'm learning a mapping between these point clouds that would match one to each other. So, and this mapping is just linear. And then once you have this mapping, you can use it to compare the weights. Basically, another way to say this is you want to compare weights that apply to the same input. So for the first layer, you can do this because you're feeding the same images to both networks. But in deeper layers, the networks might have different representations. So then it wouldn't make sense to compare the weights. And it turns out that these representations are different, but only up to a rotation. This is a, yeah, I'm happy to explain more where this comes from. But for now, you can take this as an empirical fact that you can indeed find this rotation, and then this allows you to compare weights. So let's do this. Let's train two networks on different subsets of ImageNet and align them. So I have this rotation that I'm calculating at every layer. And then I'm going to compare the eigenvectors of the weights for both networks. So each of these panels here correspond to a different layer 1 to 5. And then I have one set of eigenvectors for the first network that corresponds to the x-axis. They're ordered from large eigenvalues to small eigenvalues. And then I have another set of eigenvectors for the second network. And I can compute the inner products between all pairs of those. So if they were exactly the same, what we want to see here is a diagonal of correlation equals to 1 and then correlation equals to 0 of the diagonal. And the first surprise is that we see correlations that are above correlations between random vectors. So here I scaled the color map so that white corresponds to the baseline correlation between random vectors. And so this shows the fact that you have this, tells you that indeed, first, these networks are learning similar features, even though you train them on completely non-overlapping subsets of ImageNet. I trained them on different subsets of classes. They're not even classifying between the same classes. And to go back to our analysis here, these arrows, they're the effective dimensionality. So there's the number of significant eigenvalues for both networks. And then, for now, just eyeballing things, we could say that there is a range of directions for which there is meaningful correlation. That is d cross, this shared dimensionality, the number of eigenvectors that the two networks have in common. And we're working on really defining something proper for this. For now, this is just visual. But as you see the trend, as you go deeper in the network, it's clear that this overlap is shrinking, as we could predict just from scaling properties of the encoding. Right? We can predict something that's about generalization, that's this decrow, just from looking at how many more features you're learning when you train on more data. And indeed, these last layers, they seem to be in some memorization regime, where now what you learn is really dependent on the training set. And if you have a different training set, you have no overlap. In the first layers, there's some compression regime. It's like if you learn edge detectors, it doesn't matter what data you train on. You always learn the same thing. All right, so let me summarize what I told you about. So we have looked at this fundamental statistic of the weights, which is, I think, one of the first thing that we should measure if we want to understand what is going on in these networks. It's just the rank of the weights. And surprisingly, we really didn't expect this going into this, is that it follows simple scaling laws, which can be just proportional to width in one regime, or scaling with data, but with some interesting exponent in the data constraint regime. And so we have this sequence of exponents, now one per layer, that is ordered from 0 to 1. And it's a question if we can predict those in theory and what they tell us. But I've shown that they can be connected to generalization and memorization by looking at these comparison studies between pairs of networks and measuring this shared dimensionality. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Florentin. Do you have any questions? I have a couple, but you have the priority. Okay, so maybe we'll start with one. So I think you did a pretty good job at looking at your number of classes, number of samples, number of layers, widths, blah, blah, blah. There is one thing you did not mention, which is the optimizer.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you have any insight on the role of the optimizer, maybe like the one you used here, and does it impact?
Yeah. So here I used the SGG. I did not look at other optimizers, but there's one thing I looked at, which is different scalings. So as you scale the size of these networks, you have all these hyperparameters like learning rates and things that might depend on the width, and you might want to adapt to that. And people have studied this a lot, and now there's a sort of a natural way to do it. And I looked at two different ways of doing this, and I had basically the same results. So that's kind of one property of the optimizer. So I expect that on the for large-scale properties like these exponents, they should be pretty robust to the optimizer. But if you look at constants and maybe you can see that Adam maybe learns a little bit more features than SGD. I think that would be interesting to look at this.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you're familiar with this. I was not. Someone mentioned it last week. There is this optimizer called Muon, which apparently people use a lot in LLM.
Yeah.
And they do some whitening in the eigenspectrum of the gradient, so this could be interesting to see.
Yeah, I want to look at this because it's kind of the opposite of what we see. Is here, one thing that you would want is that to learn orthogonal weight matrices, because then everything is well conditioned and all the singular values are of the same order. But that's not at all what SGD learns. So I want to look into what is happening with this and what it means.
And maybe I'll ask again about this alignment, because
yes,
you're sort of thinking about, and maybe this is justified from your prior experiments, that the layers, for example, layer 3 performs a similar function to layer.
Yes, yeah, but that's not obvious at all.
Yeah, so that's why I'm trying to, I guess that's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Can you actually, there is this kind of path dependence in terms of the layers.
Yes. Yeah, so in fact, let me tell you a little bit of this story of where these rotations come from. So for layer 1, you don't need any rotation. You can compare things, and you see directly that these networks are learning similar subspaces in terms of the weights. But what happens is, although they learn the eigenvectors are the same, the individual neurons are not the same. And in fact, if you take a neuron in network 1 and you look for its nearest neighbor in network 2, you can't really find one. The correspondence is really at a distribution level more than individual level. It's like you have a distribution of neurons, and then you have independent samples, but because this is a high-dimensional distribution, there are no samples that are close to each other. So that's really the mental model in which now I think about networks, is that there is some distribution of neurons, and different networks have different samples. So you could think that because you have different neurons, then the representation here after layer 1 is completely different, like has nothing to do with one another. It turns out that because these networks have the same distribution of neurons, then the representations have the same geometry. So there is an object that's called the kernel. That's the distances between representations of two inputs. It doesn't depend on individual neurons, but just on the distribution. And so these two networks have the same representation. So when you change neurons without changing their distribution, the only thing you're doing is a rotation of the representation, but you're not changing the geometry. And that's really not obvious. And it took us a year to understand this. But what this means is if you have same population, then you have same representation geometry, so there's a rotation. And then you can check at layer 2 if you have the same distribution, and then if that's still true, then you have a rotation here. And you can iterate the argument through the network. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm just curious if you did that same exercise with different subsets of ImageNet, but in one subset you train it to classify coarse features like animal versus non-animal, and the other subset it would be like tigers versus lions.
Right. So I've done a little bit of this. Let me go back to a slide. So there's two things I can show you that are relevant to this. So one is this, where we have played with what classes we're discriminating between, and the closer the semantic similarity between classes, the higher the dimensionality. So that's one case. But that's just for pairs of classes. And it turns out that if you consider, let me move forward, if you consider larger sets of classes, there is a point where it doesn't matter what the classes are, you always learn the same thing. So for instance, these two lines here, I did not talk about them, but there are two different subsets of 10 classes of ImageNet. One of them is, I think, 10 different species of snakes. So I took something where they're all similar. And another is 10 different animals. So like one snake, one bird, one dog. And the dimensionality is the same. So it matters when you have very small data sets, you start to see these differences. But it seems that as you have something that's large enough, it just becomes representative of some distribution. And then it doesn't matter what the representatives are.
So the dimensionality is the same. Does that also imply that your last slide on the relationship between the ranks and the distributions of neurons would also be the same?
Oh, you're right. Yes. So this is just a comparison of rank. I did not compare the eigenvectors here to see whether they were the same or not. Yeah, no, that's a good question.
So what's your intuition?
Let's see. It's hard. There are things that push me one way and things that push me another way. Sometimes you have the same dimensionality, but you also have the same features. Sometimes it's not the case. Like for instance, on random labels, here you have the same dimensionality, and here it's different. But if you compare the eigenvectors, they're different all the way through the network. So maybe there are differences. Now I want to look at this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think very quick follow-up questions because we are almost at time. So probably you remember almost like 10 years ago, people noticed that even if you have noise in your labels, deep nets are pretty robust to them. So I'm also wondering if it's because you share the same eigenvectors basically for the first few layers or not.
So yeah, I did it one time to interpolate between true and random labels with some parameter of like label noise. So you see an interpolation between these curves. I did not do comparisons of eigenvectors. I know that when you compare no noise with full noise, it's different.
Yeah.
but
Would be interesting
yeah,
to
it
see.
could be. Probably there's a transition, right? If you have a little bit of noise, it behaves as if there is no noise,
Yeah, it's-
and some point you have, yeah, interesting.
Okay. So if there is no other question, let's thank Florentin again.
Thank you.